14-year-old Derek Rosa entered the Miami-Dade County courtroom with a chilling display of calm detachment, his face betraying not a flicker of remorse for the woman whose life he had brutally extinguished just months before. His mother, Irina Garcia, a 39-year-old woman who had given him life, raised him, and loved him unconditionally, confident that his age and honor roll status would shield him from the full weight of justice. He sat at the defense table with the casual posture of someone attending a routine school assembly rather than facing a charge of first-degree murder. The teenager had stabbed his own mother 46 times as she slept, her newborn daughter just inches away in a nearby crib, an act of violence so savage and senseless that it had left an entire community searching for answers that simply did not exist. But what Derek Rosa did not anticipate was that the evidence against him would not just come from forensic experts or seasoned detectives. The most devastating testimony would come from the one place he thought he was safe, from the very family members who had spent years defending him, protecting him, and refusing to see the monster that had been living among them all along. The night of October 12, 2023, began like any other in the Amelia Oaks apartment complex in Hialeah, Florida. The modest residential building on West 79th Place was home to working-class families, immigrants chasing the American dream, and young couples starting their lives together. Inside apartment unit 211, the soft glow of a baby monitor illuminated a small bedroom where Irina Garcia lay sleeping, her body exhausted from the demands of caring for a 2-week-old infant. The newborn girl, barely 14 days into her existence, slept peacefully in a crib position just feet from her mother's bed, unaware that she was about to witness the final moments of her mother's life. The apartment was quiet, save for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the occasional distant sound of traffic from the street below. It was a scene of domestic tranquility, a mother and child resting in the safety of their home, a tableau of vulnerability and trust that was about to be shattered by an act of incomprehensible violence. Irina Garcia had lived a life defined by sacrifice and maternal devotion. Born in Cuba, she had immigrated to the United States seeking a better future for herself and her children. She worked multiple jobs to provide for her family, her days a relentless cycle of work, childcare, and the exhausting logistics of keeping a household afloat on a modest income. Friends and neighbors described her as warm, loving, and utterly devoted to her children, a woman whose entire existence revolved around ensuring they had opportunities she never did. She had recently given birth to her daughter, a joyous addition to the family that had brought new purpose and energy to her life despite the overwhelming fatigue that came with caring for an infant. Her relationship with her son Derek had always been close, or so she believed. She was proud of his academic achievements, his status as an honor roll student at IMATER Academy, and the quiet, studious demeanor he projected to the world. She saw him as a good kid, a smart boy who would go on to do great things, a son any mother would be proud of. She had no idea that behind the facade of the obedient child lurked something far darker, a void of empathy that she had failed to see or refused to acknowledge. Derek Rosa, just 13 years old at the time, was in many ways the portrait of a model student. His teachers described him as intelligent, quiet, and academically gifted, a boy who excelled in his classes and stayed out of the trouble that seemed to ensnare so many of his peers. He was on the honor roll, a distinction that marked him as one of the school's brightest students. To the outside world, he was an unremarkable teenager, the kind of kid who blended into the background, who did his homework, who nodded politely when spoken to. But beneath this carefully maintained exterior was a mind consumed by dark obsessions. In the days and hours leading up to the murder, Derek had been conducting disturbing online searches, digital breadcrumbs that would later paint a chilling portrait of premeditation. He had searched for information about how to kill someone, whether a small knife could cut through bone, and details about lethal wounds. These were not the idle curiosities of a morbid teenager. They were the research queries of someone planning an act of violence, methodically gathering the information needed to carry out a murder. The attack itself was an act of such profound brutality that even seasoned homicide detectives would struggle to comprehend its savagery. At approximately 11:30 p.m., while Irina Garcia lay sleeping in her bed, her infant daughter just feet away, Derek entered the room carrying a large purple-handled kitchen knife, he had taken from the family's kitchen. There was no confrontation, no argument, no triggering event that would provide even the faint outline of a motive. His mother was asleep, vulnerable, and utterly defenseless. What followed was a frenzied, sustained attack of unimaginable cruelty. Derek stabbed his mother 46 times, the blade striking her neck, her torso, her arms, every part of her body except the area behind her knees. The medical examiner would later testify that the wounds covered virtually her entire body, a constellation of violence that spoke to a rage and a determination that was almost mechanical in its thoroughness. The bedroom became a scene of carnage, the walls and bedding splattered with blood, the air thick with the metallic scent of death. Through it all, the newborn baby continued to sleep in her crib, just inches away from the horror unfolding beside her, spared only by the random mercy of an attacker who, for reasons known only to him, left her physically unharmed. After the attack, Derek Rosa's behavior was as chilling as the crime itself. He did not flee. He did not panic. Instead, he calmly took out his phone and began documenting what he had done. He took photographs of his mother's lifeless body, the blood, the knife, and his own blood-covered hands. These were not pictures taken in a state of shock or dissociation. They were calculated, deliberate images, souvenirs of his act. He then sent these photos to a friend he referred to as Sweden, a contact he had made through online gaming or social media. In one particularly disturbing image, Derek posed with his tongue sticking out, his hand covered in what prosecutors would later confirm was his mother's blood, making a casual hang-loose gesture as if he had just completed a mundane task. The messages he sent were matter-of-fact, almost bored. He told his friend that he had killed his mother, that he was saying goodbye. There was no expression of horror at what he had done, no desperate plea for help, no recognition of the enormity of his actions. It was as if he were announcing he had finished his homework. Then, in what would become one of the most critical pieces of evidence against him, Derek Rosa called 911. At 11:32 p.m., just minutes after the attack, he dialed emergency services and calmly reported that he had murdered his mother. The 911 dispatcher, trained to handle all manner of emergencies, was immediately struck by the teenager's unnaturally calm demeanor. There was no crying, no screaming, no audible signs of distress. His voice was flat, almost monotone, as he provided his address and confirmed that yes, his mother was dead, and yes, he was the one who had killed her. The dispatcher kept him on the line, following protocol to ensure officers would not be walking into an active threat situation. Throughout the call, Derek remained eerily composed, answering questions with the same detached efficiency one might use when ordering food or giving directions. It was a performance, a carefully maintained facade of control that would become a defining characteristic of his behavior throughout the entire legal process that would follow. Hialeah Police Department officers arrived at the Amelia Oaks apartment complex within minutes of the 911 call, their patrol cars casting red and blue lights across the facade of the building. They approached the scene with extreme caution, weapons drawn, unsure of what they would encounter. Body camera footage, later obtained by news media, captured the tense moments as officers surrounded the apartment. Derek Rosa emerged from the front door with his hands raised, following the officers' shouted commands with mechanical precision. "Hands up! Get on the ground!" the officers yelled, their voices sharp with adrenaline and authority. The teenager complied immediately, dropping to the ground and allowing himself to be handcuffed without resistance. There was no struggle, no attempt to flee, no emotional breakdown. He simply lay there on the cold concrete, his face expressionless, as officers secured him and began the grim task of entering the apartment to confirm the horror that awaited inside. The scene inside the apartment was one of the worst that even veteran officers had encountered in their careers. Irina Garcia's body lay on the bed, her life extinguished in a cascade of violence that had transformed the small bedroom into a crime scene of profound brutality. Blood covered the sheets, the walls, and the floor, a silent testament to the sustained and savage nature of the attack. The murder weapon, a large purple-handled kitchen knife with its tip broken off, presumably from striking bone, lay near the body. The newborn baby, remarkably, was still alive and unharmed in her crib, crying now, awakened by the commotion of the police entry. One of the officers immediately scooped up the infant, cradling her protectively as he carried her out of the nightmare that had consumed her mother. The juxtaposition was stark and heartbreaking. New life and violent death existing in the same small space, separated by just a few feet, and the incomprehensible actions of a teenager who should have been protecting both of them. Derek Rosa was transported to the Hialeah Police Department headquarters for questioning. In the back of the patrol car, body camera footage showed him appearing almost relaxed, his head leaning against the window, his eyes half closed. At one point, he appeared to doze off, a detail that would later be widely reported and which added to the growing public perception of him as someone utterly devoid of normal human emotion. There was no visible anguish, no tears, no signs of the psychological collapse one might expect from someone who had just committed matricide. He was calm, composed, and seemingly unaffected by the magnitude of what he had done. For the officers transporting him, his behavior was deeply unsettling, a red flag that suggested they were not dealing with a child who had made a terrible mistake, but with something far more dangerous and incomprehensible. The interrogation of Derek Rosa, conducted by Detective Joseph Elosegui of the Hialeah Police Department's Major Crimes Unit, would become a critical piece of evidence in the case against him. The video, later released to the public and played in court, showed a teenager who was disturbingly articulate and unemotional as he confessed to murdering his mother. Detective Elosegui, an experienced investigator, approached the interview with a calm, methodical strategy, asking open-ended questions and allowing Derek to narrate the events in his own words. The detective began by establishing basic facts. "You killed her?" he asked, his voice steady. Derek nodded, a simple, affirmative gesture, and responded, "Yes." There was no hesitation, no attempt to deny or minimize what he had done. The confession that followed was chilling in its clinical detachment. Derek described waking up, going to the kitchen, and selecting a large knife with a purple handle. He recounted entering his mother's bedroom and attacking her as she slept, his voice remaining flat and emotionless throughout the recitation. When asked where he had stabbed her, he calmly pointed to his own neck, indicating the location of major arteries, demonstrating a knowledge of human anatomy that suggested his online research had been thorough and purposeful. Throughout the interrogation, Derek Rosa never expressed remorse. He never cried. He never asked about his baby sister or showed any concern for what would happen to her now that their mother was dead. He simply answered the questions put to him, his responses delivered with the same tone one might use to describe the plot of a movie. At one point, Detective Elosegui asked him why he had done it, the single most important question in the entire investigation. It was at this moment that Derek's facade showed its first crack. He paused, looked down at the table, and then asked to use the bathroom. When he returned, rather than answering the question, he looked at the detective and said, "I want a lawyer." It was a calculated move, the invocation of his legal rights at the precise moment when he would have been forced to provide the one thing he could not, a rational explanation for his actions. The question of motive would remain unanswered, a black hole at the center of the case that would frustrate investigators, prosecutors, and the family members desperate to understand why. The aftermath of Irina Garcia's murder sent shockwaves through the Hialeah community. The small city, known for its large Cuban-American population and tight-knit neighborhoods, was stunned by the brutality of the crime and the age of the perpetrator. How could a 13-year-old honor roll student murder his own mother? The question was asked in homes, schools, and churches, a collective attempt to make sense of the senseless. Vigils were held for Irina, with neighbors and community members gathering to light candles and share memories of a woman who had been, by all accounts, a devoted mother and a kind neighbor. Her murder was not just a personal tragedy for her family. It was a wound to the entire community, a violation of the fundamental assumption that children, especially good students, did not murder their parents. The case became a media sensation, with local and national news outlets covering every development, each new detail adding to the public's fascination and horror. The legal proceedings began swiftly. Derek Rosa was initially charged with second-degree murder, but a Miami-Dade County grand jury, after reviewing the evidence of premeditation, the disturbing online searches, the photographs, and the sheer brutality of the attack, returned an indictment for first-degree murder. The decision to charge him as an adult was controversial but, given the nature of the crime, seemed inevitable. Florida law allows for juveniles as young as 14 to be tried as adults in cases of first-degree murder. And while Derek was only 13 at the time of the killing, prosecutors argued that the sophistication of the crime and his behavior afterward demonstrated a level of culpability that warranted adult prosecution. The grand jury agreed. Derek would face the same justice system, the same potential penalties, as an adult defendant. It was a decision that would shape every aspect of the case that followed. Derek Rosa was initially held in a juvenile detention facility, but as the case progressed and he turned 14, he was transferred to the Metro West Detention Center, an adult facility where he was held in a segregated unit with other juveniles charged as adults. This decision, too, became a point of controversy. His defense attorneys, led by the famous Jose Baez, whose high-profile clients had included Casey Anthony and Aaron Hernandez, argued that holding a 14-year-old in an adult jail violated his constitutional rights and exposed him to conditions that were inappropriate for a child. They filed multiple motions to have him returned to a juvenile facility, arguing that he was not receiving adequate education, mental health services, or the developmental support that a child his age required. The prosecution countered that Derek's behavior, both in the crime and in custody, demonstrated that he was a danger to others and that the security of an adult facility was necessary to ensure public safety. Judge Richard Hirsch, who would oversee the case, found himself in the difficult position of balancing Derek's rights as a minor with the severity of the crime he was accused of committing and the need to ensure he did not pose a threat to others in custody. As Derek sat in the Metro West Detention Center, a surprising groundswell of public support began to emerge. Online petitions calling for him to be tried as a juvenile rather than an adult began to circulate, eventually gathering tens of thousands of signatures. Groups of mothers from across the country, including a Chicago mother named Irina Reyes, began traveling to Miami to attend Derek's court hearings, wearing shirts that read, "Justice for Derek," and "He is not an adult, he is a boy." They held press conferences outside the courthouse, arguing that Derek was innocent, that he had been manipulated by someone else, and that the evidence against him did not tell the whole story. Reyes and others pointed to background noises in the 911 call, which they claimed suggested another person had been present in the apartment, and argued that a 13-year-old could easily be coerced or controlled by an adult. Their theory, however, was not supported by any physical evidence. Every piece of forensic analysis, every witness statement, every frame of video surveillance pointed to Derek Rosa acting alone. The support, while passionate and well-intentioned, seemed to be based more on an emotional belief that children could not commit such atrocities than on any factual analysis of the case. The defense strategy, crafted by Jose Baez and his team, was always going to be an uphill battle. The evidence against Derek was overwhelming. His confession, the photographs he had taken and sent to a friend, the online searches, the murder weapon found at the scene, and the surveillance footage from the baby monitor that showed a figure hovering over Irina Garcia's bed all pointed inescapably to his guilt. Baez, a skilled attorney with a reputation for taking on seemingly impossible cases, knew that arguing innocence was a non-starter. Instead, the defense would have to focus on mitigation, on presenting Derek not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a deeply troubled child, a victim of undiagnosed mental illness, a boy whose brain was not fully developed and who lacked the capacity to fully understand the consequences of his actions. The strategy would rely heavily on expert testimony about adolescent brain development, on painting a picture of a child in crisis, and on eliciting sympathy from a jury that might be moved to show mercy to someone so young. But there was a problem with this strategy, and it was sitting at the defense table. Derek Rosa's behavior in court was not that of a troubled, remorseful child. From his very first appearance, he projected an aura of calm detachment that was deeply unsettling to everyone who observed him. He sat at the defense table, dressed in the standard brown jumpsuit issued to juvenile defendants in adult custody, his face impassive, his eyes often wandering around the courtroom as if he were mildly bored by the proceedings. There were no tears, no visible signs of anguish or regret. On several occasions, observers noted what appeared to be a faint smirk on his face, a slight upward curve of his lips that suggested not remorse, but something closer to amusement or contempt. The contrast between the defense's narrative of a troubled child and the reality of the composed, emotionally flat teenager sitting before the court was stark and impossible to ignore. Every attempt by his legal team to humanize him was undermined by his own demeanor, which seemed to communicate a profound indifference to the gravity of his situation. The pretrial hearings became a showcase for the strength of the prosecution's case. The state, led by experienced prosecutors from the Miami-Dade County State Attorney's Office, methodically presented their evidence in motion after motion, each filing adding another layer to the mountain of proof against Derek. Forensic experts testified about the blood evidence, confirming that the DNA found on Derek's hands, on his clothing, and throughout the crime scene was an exact match to Irina Garcia. The medical examiner provided a detailed analysis of the 46 stab wounds, explaining the level of force required, the repetitive nature of the attack, and the fact that the wounds covered virtually her entire body, suggesting a sustained and deliberate act rather than a momentary loss of control. Digital forensic specialists presented Derek's Google search history, which painted a chilling picture of premeditation. The searches, conducted in the hours before the murder, included how to kill someone, can a small knife cut through bone, and inquiries about firearms, suggesting that Derek had considered multiple methods before settling on the knife attack. Each piece of testimony was delivered with clinical precision, building an irrefutable case of premeditated, first-degree murder. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence was the surveillance footage from the baby monitor in Irina Garcia's bedroom. The grainy, black-and-white video, captured in the infrared mode designed to allow parents to check on sleeping infants, showed a figure entering the room at approximately 11:27 p.m. The video quality was poor, the resolution low, but the silhouette was unmistakable. A person, moving with deliberate purpose, approached the bed where Irina lay sleeping. The camera, positioned to capture the crib, also captured the edge of the bed, and in the pixelated, ghostly footage, the outline of the attack was visible. The figure raised its arm repeatedly, the distinctive motion of stabbing, over and over again. The video had no audio, but the violence of the act was clear even in the silent, grainy images. It was perhaps the most damning piece of evidence in the entire case, a real-time documentation of the murder that left no room for alternative theories or reasonable doubt. When the prosecution played the video in court during a pretrial hearing, the effect was devastating. The courtroom fell into an oppressive silence, broken only by the quiet sobs of family members who were seeing, for the first time, a visual representation of Irina's final moments. Derek Rosa's reaction to the video was a focal point of intense scrutiny. As the footage played on the large screen at the front of the courtroom, all eyes were on the defendant. Would he show remorse? Would he look away in shame or break down in tears at the visual evidence of his horrific act? Instead, Derek sat motionless, his face a blank mask, his eyes fixed on the screen with an expression that could only be described as clinical interest. He watched the silhouette of himself murdering his mother with the same detached curiosity one might have while watching a nature documentary. There was no visible emotional reaction, no flicker of humanity in his eyes. It was a moment that would be seared into the memory of everyone present, a chilling confirmation that whatever capacity for empathy or remorse might exist in a normal human being was simply absent in this teenager. The juxtaposition was stark and horrifying. On the screen, a brutal murder unfolding in real time. In the courtroom, the perpetrator watching with the emotional engagement of someone viewing a mildly interesting science experiment. The prosecution also introduced testimony about the photographs Derek had taken after the murder and sent to his friend Sweden. A digital forensics expert walked the court through the metadata of the images, confirming they were taken within minutes of the 911 call, and explained the significance of Derek's decision to document his crime. The expert testified that this behavior suggested not a crime of passion or a momentary breakdown, but a calculated, deliberate act by someone who wanted to preserve a record of what he had done. The prosecution argued that the photographs were trophies, mementos of an act that Derek was proud of rather than horrified by. When the images themselves were displayed in court, with identifying details blurred but the blood and the casual pose visible, a wave of revulsion swept through the gallery. These were not pictures taken by someone in a state of shock or dissociation. They were selfies, casual documentation of violence, images that spoke to a level of psychological abnormality that was both fascinating and terrifying. The defense team, led by Jose Baez, worked tirelessly to counter the prosecution's narrative, but they were fighting a battle on multiple fronts. The evidence was overwhelming, and their client's behavior in court was actively undermining every attempt to build sympathy for him. Baez, known for his aggressive and creative legal strategies, filed a series of motions challenging various aspects of the prosecution's case. He argued that Derek's confession should be suppressed, claiming that the teenager had not fully understood his Miranda rights and that the interrogation had been coercive given his age and psychological state. The prosecution countered with the interrogation video itself, which showed Derek calmly waiving his rights, answering questions articulately, and demonstrating a clear understanding of the legal process. The motion was denied. Baez also challenged the decision to transfer Derek to adult court, presenting expert testimony about adolescent brain development and arguing that the juvenile system was better equipped to rehabilitate a child offender. The prosecution responded with evidence of the crime's brutality and Derek's complete lack of remorse, arguing that he posed a clear danger to public safety. That motion, too, was denied. Throughout these legal battles, Derek Rosa remained a passive, detached presence in his own defense. He attended every hearing, sitting at the defense table with the same blank expression, his eyes occasionally meeting those of the judge or the prosecutors, but revealing nothing. He whispered occasionally to his lawyers, but his body language conveyed boredom rather than concern. He seemed utterly disconnected from the proceedings, as if they were happening to someone else. This detachment was particularly notable during hearings where his future was being decided. When Judge Hirsch ruled that Derek would be tried as an adult, a decision that meant he could potentially face life in prison, Derek showed no visible reaction. He simply sat there, his face impassive, his hands folded on the table, as if the judge had just announced a routine scheduling matter rather than a decision that would determine the trajectory of his entire life. The most challenging aspect of the defense strategy was finding experts who could credibly explain Derek's behavior in a way that would elicit sympathy from a jury. Baez brought in a team of forensic psychologists and psychiatrists who conducted extensive evaluations of Derek, searching for any diagnostic explanation for his actions. The results were troubling. Multiple experts diagnosed him with various conduct disorders, antisocial personality traits, and a profound deficit in empathetic capacity. But these diagnoses, rather than helping the defense, seemed to reinforce the prosecution's narrative. A teenager with no empathy, no remorse, and a history of escalating antisocial behavior was not a sympathetic figure. He was a dangerous one. The defense tried to frame these diagnoses as evidence of mental illness, arguing that Derek was not evil but sick, not a monster but a patient in need of treatment rather than punishment. But the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. They pointed out that millions of people live with mental health issues without resorting to violence, that a diagnosis was not an excuse, and that Derek's careful planning, his methodical research, and his calm behavior after the crime all demonstrated a level of cognitive function that belied any claim of insanity or diminished capacity. As the trial date approached, the public fascination with the case only intensified. True crime podcasts devoted multiple episodes to dissecting every aspect of the case. Online forums were filled with heated debates about whether a 13-year-old could truly be held responsible for such a horrific act. Mental health advocates argued that the case highlighted the failures of the system to identify and intervene with troubled children before they became violent. Victims' rights groups countered that the age of the perpetrator did not diminish the horror of the crime or the need for justice. The case became a flashpoint in the ongoing debate about juvenile justice, about the age of criminal responsibility, and about whether children who commit adult crimes should face adult consequences. Derek Rosa, the quiet honor roll student from Hialeah, had become a national symbol of one of the most troubling questions in criminal justice. At what age does a child become a monster? The trial itself was scheduled to begin in early 2024, nearly a year after Irina Garcia's murder. The Miami-Dade County Courthouse braced for an onslaught of media attention, with news crews from across the country setting up outside the building. Security was heightened, with additional officers assigned to manage the expected crowds and to ensure the safety of all participants. The courtroom, one of the largest in the building, was selected to accommodate the extensive media presence and the large number of family members, community members, and concerned citizens who wanted to witness the proceedings. The atmosphere in the days leading up to the trial was tense and electric, a palpable sense that the community was about to confront one of the most disturbing crimes in its history. The jury selection process was grueling and took several weeks. Both the prosecution and the defense understood that the composition of the jury would be critical to the outcome of the case. The prosecutors sought jurors who could set aside sympathy for Derek's age and focus on the brutality of the crime and the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. They looked for logical, analytical thinkers who would be moved by forensic evidence and who could comprehend the difference between a child making a mistake and a calculating killer who happened to be young. The defense, in contrast, looked for empathetic, emotionally driven jurors who might be swayed by the narrative of a troubled child, who would struggle with the idea of sending a teenager to prison for life, and who could be persuaded that rehabilitation was still possible. Potential jurors were questioned extensively about their views on juvenile crime, on capital punishment for minors, on mental health, and on their ability to remain impartial despite the horrific nature of the evidence they would see. One of the most challenging aspects of jury selection was finding people who had not already formed strong opinions about the case. The media coverage had been so extensive, the details so widely disseminated, that nearly every potential juror had heard at least something about Derek Rosa and the murder of his mother. Many had to be dismissed for cause, having already decided that Derek was guilty or innocent based on what they had seen in the news. The voir dire process became a window into public opinion, with potential jurors expressing a wide range of views. Some were adamant that a 13-year-old could not possibly have committed such a crime without being coerced or manipulated. Others were equally certain that age was irrelevant when the crime was this brutal. Some broke down in tears during questioning, unable to comprehend how a child could murder his own mother. Others approached the case with a cold, clinical detachment, viewing it as a straightforward matter of evidence and law. After 3 weeks of questioning, a jury of 12 and 2 alternates was finally seated. They were a diverse group, representing a cross-section of Miami's population, and they would now be tasked with one of the most difficult responsibilities any citizen can face, determining the fate of a child accused of an unspeakable crime. The opening day of the trial arrived with a media circus surrounding the courthouse. Satellite trucks lined the streets, reporters jostled for position on the courthouse steps, and crowds of onlookers gathered, hoping to catch a glimpse of the proceedings or the key participants. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was somber and tense. On one side of the gallery sat members of Irina Garcia's family, their faces etched with grief and a desperate hunger for justice. They had lost a daughter, a sister, a niece, and they wanted to see the person responsible held accountable, regardless of his age. On the other side of the courtroom sat the supporters of Derek Rosa, the mothers who had traveled from across the country, clutching their justice for Derek signs and wearing their matching t-shirts. They believed, with a fervor that bordered on religious conviction, that Derek was innocent, or at the very least, that he deserved mercy and a chance at redemption. Between these two camps sat the press, the legal observers, and the general public, all crammed into the courtroom to witness what promised to be one of the most compelling and disturbing trials in recent memory. Derek Rosa was led into the courtroom by 2 bailiffs, his hands cuffed in front of him, dressed in a white button-down shirt and dark pants that his lawyers had provided to make him look more like a child and less like a criminal. He walked with a casual stride, his face expressionless, and took his seat at the defense table between Jose Baez and another member of his defense team. He glanced briefly at the jury, his eyes scanning their faces with a detached curiosity, and then settled into his chair, folding his hands on the table in front of him. There was no visible nervousness, no signs of the anxiety that most defendants display on the first day of their trial. He simply sat there, calm and composed, as if he were attending a school lecture rather than facing a trial that could result in him spending the rest of his life in prison. The trial began with the opening statements, the critical moment when both sides would lay out their narratives and attempt to frame the case in the most favorable light. The lead prosecutor, a veteran attorney named Sarah Fernandez, approached the lectern with a somber, determined expression. She began her statement not with the crime itself, but with the victim, She spoke of Irina Garcia, painting a vivid portrait of a hard-working immigrant mother who had sacrificed everything for her children. She described Irina's dreams for her family, her joy at the birth of her daughter, and the love she had for her son Derek. She spoke of the night of October 12th, of a mother peacefully sleeping next to her newborn baby, secure in the belief that she was safe in her own home. And then, with her voice hardening, she described the attack. She did not spare the jury any details. She told them about the 46 stab wounds, about the sustained and brutal nature of the attack, about the baby monitor footage that captured the silhouette of the killer at work. She described Derek's behavior after the murder, the photographs he took, the casual messages he sent, and his emotionless 911 call. Her voice rose with righteous anger as she pointed at the defendant and declared, "That young man sitting right there did not make a mistake. He did not have a momentary lapse in judgment. He planned this murder, he executed it with precision and brutality, and then he documented it like a trophy. Over the next days and weeks, you will see overwhelming evidence of his guilt, and you will see something perhaps even more disturbing. You will see a complete and total absence of remorse. You will see a young man who, even now, as he sits in this courtroom facing justice, shows no recognition of the horror he has inflicted, no empathy for the victim, no understanding of the permanence of what he has done." Jose Baez rose for the defense's opening statement, his approach a stark contrast to the prosecution's emotional appeal. He began by acknowledging the tragedy, expressing sympathy for Irina Garcia and her family, and admitting that Derek was responsible for her death. It was a risky strategy, but Baez knew that denying the undeniable would cost him all credibility with the jury. Instead, he pivoted to the question of why. He spoke of Derek not as a monster, but as a deeply troubled child, a boy whose brain was not fully developed, who suffered from undiagnosed mental health issues, and who, on the night of October 12th, experienced a catastrophic psychological break that led to an act of unimaginable violence. Baez spoke of the science of adolescent brain development, explaining to the jury that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and understanding consequences, is not fully mature until a person reaches their mid-20s. He argued that Derek, at just 13 years old, lacked the neurological capacity to fully comprehend the permanence and severity of his actions. He spoke of Derek's struggles in school, of signs of mental distress that were missed or ignored, and of a system that failed to identify a child in crisis before tragedy struck. He ended his statement with a plea for the jury to see Derek as a child, not a monster, and to choose compassion and rehabilitation over vengeance and permanent punishment. It was a well-crafted, emotionally resonant speech, delivered with Baez's characteristic passion and skill. But as both lawyers spoke, delivering their carefully prepared narratives, the most powerful evidence in the courtroom was sitting silently at the defense table. Derek Rosa's behavior during the opening statements was a study in detachment and indifference. While the prosecutor described the brutal murder of his mother, detailing each of the 46 stab wounds, Derek sat with his chin resting on his hand, his eyes wandering around the courtroom, occasionally glancing at the ceiling or studying his fingernails. When Sarah Fernandez described how he had photographed his mother's body and sent the images to a friend, Derek's expression did not change. There was no shame, no visible discomfort, no flicker of emotion. He simply sat there, as calm and unmoved as if he were listening to someone read the phone book. When his own lawyer spoke of his troubled mental state and his status as a child in crisis, Derek actually shook his head slightly, a barely perceptible gesture that suggested disagreement or dismissal. It was as if he resented being portrayed as weak or damaged, as if the narrative of a troubled child offended his sense of self. The jury watched this display with growing unease, their faces reflecting a mixture of fascination and revulsion. Whatever sympathy they might have felt for Derek's age was being systematically eroded by his own behavior, by the cold, empty mask he presented to the world. The prosecution's case unfolded over the following weeks with devastating precision. Sarah Fernandez and her team presented their evidence in a carefully orchestrated sequence, each witness and each piece of testimony building on the last to create an overwhelming edifice of proof. The first witnesses were the first responders, the Hialeah police officers who had arrived at the apartment that night, and discovered the horror inside. They testified about the 911 call, about Derek's calm demeanor when they took him into custody, and about the scene they found when they entered the apartment. One officer, a veteran with 20 years on the force, struggled to maintain his composure as he described finding the baby, still alive in her crib, just feet from her mother's body. "It's the worst thing I've ever seen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I've seen a lot in this job. But this, a mother murdered in her bed with her baby right there, and her own son responsible, it's something that stays with you forever." The medical examiner, Dr. Maria Santos, provided testimony that was both clinical and horrifying. She walked the jury through each of the 46 stab wounds, using anatomical diagrams and photographs of the autopsy to illustrate the extent of the violence. She explained that many of the wounds were defensive, inflicted on Irina's hands and arms as she tried desperately to protect herself, suggesting that she had woken up during the attack and fought for her life. The fact that there were so many wounds, Dr. Santos testified, indicated that this was not a momentary loss of control but a sustained, deliberate assault that lasted several minutes. She described how some wounds were superficial while others were deep, how the pattern suggested the attacker had struck repeatedly from multiple angles, and how the location of the wounds, covering virtually every part of the body except the backs of the legs, indicated a methodical thoroughness. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Santos concluded, "these injuries are consistent with an attack of extreme brutality and sustained rage. The victim suffered tremendously before she died." As she spoke, several jurors looked away from the graphic images displayed on the screen, their faces pale. But Derek Rosa's gaze never wavered. He stared at the autopsy photos of his mother with the same clinical detachment he had shown throughout the trial, as if he were looking at abstract art rather than the documented evidence of his own violent act. The forensic evidence was equally damning. DNA analysts testified that blood found on Derek's hands, on his clothing, and under his fingernails was a perfect match to Irina Garcia. The probability of the DNA belonging to anyone else was 1 in several trillion, a number so astronomical that it effectively eliminated any possibility of coincidence or error. Fingerprint experts confirmed that Derek's prints were found on the handle of the murder weapon, the purple-handled kitchen knife that had been used to inflict the fatal wounds. Digital forensic specialists walked the jury through Derek's Google search history, displaying on a large screen the chilling queries he had made in the hours before the murder. The searches, time-stamped and preserved in Google's servers, created an irrefutable timeline of premeditation. At 7:15 p.m., he had searched "how to kill someone quietly." At 8:42 p.m., "can a small knife kill?" At 10:33 p.m., just an hour before the attack, "where to stab someone to kill them fast." Each search result was displayed for the jury, the words stark and undeniable on the screen. The prosecution's expert testified that these searches demonstrated clear planning and intent, that Derek had not acted on a sudden impulse, but had spent hours researching the most effective way to commit murder. The most devastating piece of evidence, however, was the surveillance footage from the baby monitor. The prosecution played the video multiple times, from different angles and at different speeds, ensuring that every member of the jury fully understood what they were seeing. The grainy, infrared footage showed the bedroom in shades of gray and white, the crib in the foreground, the bed in the background. At 11:27 p.m., a figure entered the frame, moving slowly and deliberately toward the bed. The silhouette was unmistakably that of a young person, smaller and slighter than an adult. The figure stood beside the bed for several seconds, completely still, and then the arm rose and fell, over and over again in a repetitive, mechanical motion. The attack lasted approximately 2 minutes, though in the silent, ghostly footage, it seemed to stretch on for an eternity. When the figure finally stopped and stepped back from the bed, it stood there for another moment, motionless, before turning and walking out of the frame. The video was silent, but the violence it depicted was deafening. When the footage ended, the courtroom was engulfed in a heavy, oppressive silence. Several family members in the gallery were openly weeping. The jurors sat frozen, their faces reflecting horror and disbelief. And Derek Rosa, the teenager whose silhouette they had just watched committing matricide, sat at the defense table with his arms crossed, his expression unchanged, as if he had just watched a mildly interesting educational video. The photographs that Derek had taken after the murder and sent to his friend Sweden were introduced next, though out of respect for the victim and the family, the most graphic images were not displayed to the public gallery. The jury, however, was shown everything. Forensic experts testified about the metadata embedded in the images, confirming that they were taken on Derek's phone just minutes after the attack. One photograph in particular drew gasps from the jury. It showed Derek's hand, covered in blood, making a casual shaka or hang loose gesture, his tongue sticking out in what appeared to be a playful, almost celebratory expression. A digital forensics expert testified that the image had been sent via a messaging app to a contact saved in Derek's phone as Sweden, along with a message that read, "I'm sorry, bro. I gotta say goodbye. I killed my mom." The prosecution argued that these photographs and messages demonstrated not just a lack of remorse, but something far more disturbing, a sense of pride or accomplishment in what he had done. The images were not the desperate documentation of someone in shock. They were selfies, casual snapshots that suggested Derek saw his crime not as a tragedy, but as an achievement worthy of being shared. The friend known as Sweden, whose real name was withheld due to his age and location, provided testimony via video deposition. He was a teenager in Europe whom Derek had befriended through online gaming. He described receiving the photos and messages in the middle of his night, being shocked and confused, and initially thinking it was some kind of sick joke. When he realized Derek was serious, he immediately contacted local authorities, who in turn alerted the Hialeah Police Department. "I couldn't believe it," the friend said, his face pixelated to protect his identity. "Derek always seemed normal when we played games online. He was quiet, didn't talk much about his personal life. I never would have thought he was capable of something like this. When he sent me those pictures, I didn't know what to do. I was terrified." The prosecution used this testimony to demonstrate that Derek's online persona was consistent with his courtroom demeanor, calm, detached, and emotionally flat, a young man who could commit a horrific act of violence and then discuss it with the same casual tone he might use to talk about a video game. The 911 call was played in its entirety for the jury, Derek's voice filling the courtroom with its eerie calmness. The dispatcher's questions and Derek's responses created a chilling dialogue that seemed to exist in a world without emotion or consequence. 911, what's your emergency? I killed my mother. You what? I killed my mother. I stabbed her. Where is she now? She's in her bed. She's dead. The matter-of-fact tone, the absence of panic or distress, the clinical precision of his responses, all of it combined to create a portrait of someone utterly disconnected from the gravity of what he had done. A forensic audio expert testified that there were no signs of coercion or duress in Derek's voice, no indication that anyone else was present or influencing his statements. He was calm, coherent, and in complete control of himself. The prosecution argued that this demonstrated consciousness of guilt and a clear understanding of his actions. If Derek had been in a dissociative state or experiencing a psychotic break, as the defense would later argue, he would not have been capable of such calm, rational communication. As the prosecution's case continued, a clearer picture of Derek's life before the murder began to emerge. Teachers from Imodder Academy testified about his academic performance, confirming that he was indeed an honor roll student, intelligent and capable. But they also described a student who was socially isolated, who had few friends, and who seemed to exist in his own private world. One teacher recalled an incident where Derek had written a creative writing assignment that was so violent and disturbing that she had reported it to the school counselor. The story, she testified, involved a detailed description of a home invasion and murder. At the time, it was dismissed as the product of a teenager's dark imagination, perhaps influenced by violent movies or video games. In hindsight, it seemed like a chilling blueprint for what was to come. The school counselor testified that he had met with Derek once after the incident, but found him polite, articulate, and seemingly well-adjusted. There were no obvious red flags, no signs of imminent violence. Derek had simply explained that he enjoyed writing horror stories and that the assignment was purely fictional. The counselor, overworked and dealing with hundreds of students, had accepted this explanation and closed the case. Neighbors from the Amelia Oaks apartment complex provided testimony that painted a picture of a quiet, unremarkable family. They described Irina as a loving, devoted mother who worked constantly to provide for her children. They remembered Derek as a polite, quiet boy who kept to himself. No one reported any signs of domestic violence, no screaming arguments, no indication that anything was wrong behind the closed door of apartment 211. One neighbor did recall something that, in retrospect, seemed significant. About a week before the murder, she had encountered Derek in the hallway late at night. He was just standing there, outside his own apartment door, staring at it with an expression she described as blank and creepy. When she asked if he was okay, he had simply nodded and gone inside without saying a word. At the time, she had dismissed it as typical teenage weirdness. Now, she wondered if he had been contemplating what he was about to do, if he had been standing there, working up the nerve or planning the attack. The prosecution used this testimony to suggest that Derek's crime was not a sudden impulse, but the culmination of days or even weeks of planning and mental preparation. The final witness for the prosecution was Detective Joseph Elosegui, the lead investigator on the case. He provided a comprehensive overview of the investigation, walking the jury through the timeline of events from the 911 call to Derek's arrest and interrogation. He described the crime scene, the evidence collected, and the painstaking process of building the case. When asked about his impressions of Derek during the interrogation, Detective Elosegui paused, choosing his words carefully. In my 23 years as a detective, I have interviewed hundreds of suspects, including many juveniles. Derek Rosa was different. He showed no emotion, no remorse, no recognition of the severity of what he had done. When I asked him why he killed his mother, he couldn't or wouldn't answer. He just looked at me and asked for a lawyer. It was as if the question didn't even make sense to him. As if asking why he did it was like asking why the sky is blue. He did it because he did it. There was no deeper reason that he was willing or able to articulate. This testimony was particularly powerful because it came from a seasoned investigator who had seen the full spectrum of human behavior. His assessment of Derek as someone fundamentally different, someone lacking the normal emotional responses that even hardened criminals display, resonated deeply with the jury. With the conclusion of Detective Elosegui's testimony, the prosecution rested its case. Sarah Fernandez stood at her table and announced, "Your Honor, the state rests," her voice firm and confident. She had presented a case that was overwhelming in its thoroughness and devastating in its implications. The physical evidence, the forensic analysis, the video footage, the photographs, the 911 call, and the defendant's own confession had all combined to create an irrefutable narrative of guilt. But perhaps more importantly, she had allowed Derek Rosa himself to be the most powerful evidence against him. His behavior in court, his complete lack of remorse, his cold, detached demeanor, had spoken louder than any witness testimony or forensic report. The jury had spent weeks watching him, and what they had seen was a young man utterly devoid of empathy or conscience, a living embodiment of the monster the prosecution had described in their opening statement. The burden now shifted to the defense, and Jose Baez rose to present his case with the weight of the world on his shoulders. He knew that the evidence against his client was insurmountable, that arguing innocence would be not just futile, but insulting to the jury's intelligence. His only hope was to humanize Derek, to create enough doubt about his mental state and culpability that the jury would show mercy in their verdict or, more realistically, in their sentencing recommendation. Baez's strategy was to present expert testimony about adolescent brain development and mental health, to argue that Derek was not a monster but a deeply sick child who needed treatment, not punishment. It was a strategy born of desperation, but it was the only viable path forward. The defense's first witness was Dr. Robert Chun, a renowned forensic psychologist and expert in adolescent brain development. Dr. Chun had conducted extensive evaluations of Derek, including psychological testing, interviews, and brain imaging studies. He testified that Derek exhibited signs of severe conduct disorder, possible schizoid personality traits, and what he described as a profound deficit in affective empathy, meaning the ability to emotionally connect with and understand the feelings of others. Using colorful brain scans and diagrams, Dr. Chun explained to the jury how the adolescent brain differs from an adult brain, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control, planning, and understanding long-term consequences. He argued that at 13, Derek's brain was still highly immature, and that his capacity for moral reasoning and emotional regulation was significantly compromised. Dr. Chen testified that in his professional opinion, Derek had been experiencing a severe dissociative state at the time of the murder, a psychological condition where a person becomes disconnected from reality and acts in ways that they would not under normal circumstances. It was a compelling theory, presented by a credible expert with impressive credentials. However, the prosecution's cross-examination of Dr. Chen was brutal and effective. Sarah Fernandez methodically dismantled his testimony, forcing him to concede point after point. She got him to admit that millions of teenagers have underdeveloped prefrontal cortexes without committing murder. She confronted him with Derek's online searches, asking how someone in a dissociative state could conduct such specific, goal-oriented research hours before the crime. She questioned how someone experiencing a break from reality could calmly call 911, take photographs, and send coherent messages to a friend. Dr. Chen struggled to explain these inconsistencies, falling back on generalities about the complexity of the human mind and the unique nature of each case. Fernandez then played excerpts from Derek's interrogation video, showing the jury once again how calm, rational, and oriented to reality Derek had been just hours after the murder. "Dr. Chen," she asked, her voice dripping with skepticism, "does this look like someone who was in a dissociative state? Does this sound like someone who didn't understand what he was doing?" The expert had no good answer, and his credibility was severely damaged. The jury watched this exchange closely, and it was clear from their expressions that they were not convinced by the defense's psychological theories. The defense's next witness was Derek's stepfather, who testified about the family dynamics and Derek's behavior in the months leading up to the murder. He described Derek as a quiet, introverted boy who spent most of his time in his room, either doing homework or playing video games. He admitted that he and Derek had never been particularly close, that Derek had resented his presence in the family, and that their relationship was strained. He testified that he had never seen Derek be violent or aggressive, that there had been no warning signs that something like this could happen. But under cross-examination, the stepfather was forced to admit that he had been largely absent from Derek's life, working long hours and spending little time at home. He conceded that he really didn't know what Derek was thinking or feeling, that they barely communicated, and that it was possible Derek had been struggling with issues that no one in the family had noticed or addressed. The prosecution used this testimony to argue that Derek's crime was not the product of a troubled home life, but of something internal and pathological, something that existed within him regardless of his external circumstances. The defense had planned to call several more witnesses, including additional psychological experts and character witnesses who would testify about Derek's good qualities and potential for rehabilitation. But as the trial progressed, it became increasingly clear that this strategy was not working. The jury seemed unmoved by the expert testimony about brain development and mental health. They had seen the evidence, they had watched the videos, and most importantly, they had observed Derek himself for weeks. The narrative of a troubled child simply did not align with the reality of the calm, emotionless teenager sitting at the defense table. Jose Baez found himself in an impossible position. Every attempt to humanize his client was undermined by Derek's own behavior. The psychological theories, no matter how well presented, could not overcome the visceral impact of watching Derek sit impassively through testimony about the brutal murder of his mother. The defense's final and most critical witness was supposed to be Derek's grandmother, Irina's mother, who had flown in from Cuba to testify on her grandson's behalf. She was to provide testimony about Derek's early childhood, about his relationship with his mother, and to plead with the jury to show mercy to her grandson despite the horror of what he had done. It was to be an emotional appeal, a grandmother's desperate attempt to save the last remaining member of her immediate family. Jose Baez had spent hours preparing her, coaching her on what to say and how to say it. But on the morning she was scheduled to testify, in a private conference with Baez and the prosecution, something unexpected happened. The grandmother broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, and confessed that she could not do it. She could not go on that witness stand and ask for mercy for the boy who had murdered her daughter. In the hallway outside the courtroom, away from the jury and the public, Derek's grandmother sat in a small witness room, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking with sobs. Jose Baez sat beside her, his own expression one of helpless frustration. Through an interpreter, the grandmother explained that she had tried. She had wanted to help her grandson, but every time she looked at him in court, every time she saw his blank, emotionless face, she saw not her sweet grandchild, but the monster who had stolen her daughter from the world. She spoke of sleepless nights, of nightmares where she heard her daughter's screams, of the unbearable weight of knowing that Irina had died in terror and pain at the hands of her own child. She said she had watched Derek throughout the trial, hoping to see some sign of the boy she remembered, some flicker of remorse or humanity. But there was nothing, just cold, empty eyes that looked through people rather than at them. "I cannot save him," she said through her tears. "I cannot ask them to show mercy when he shows none. My daughter deserves justice, and I cannot betray her memory by defending the one who killed her." This was a devastating blow to the defense. Without the grandmother's testimony, Baez had no compelling emotional witness to put before the jury. He had psychological experts whose testimony had been effectively dismantled, and he had a client who was his own worst enemy. Faced with this reality, Jose Baez made the difficult decision to rest his case earlier than planned, without calling any additional witnesses. It was a calculated gamble. He hoped that by keeping the defense case brief, he could avoid giving the prosecution more opportunities to reinforce their narrative. But it also meant that the last impression the jury would have before deliberations was not of a sympathetic witness pleading for Derek's life, but of the prosecution's overwhelming evidence of his guilt and his disturbing lack of remorse. Before closing arguments, however, the court moved into the victim impact statement phase, a moment when family members would have the opportunity to address the court and speak directly about the impact of Irina Garcia's murder. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted, becoming even more somber and emotionally charged. The first to speak was Irina's sister, Isabella, who had flown in from Cuba for the trial. She approached the podium with trembling legs, clutching a photograph of Irina and her children taken just months before the murder. Her voice, when she began to speak, was thick with grief and anger. She spoke in Spanish, with a court interpreter translating her words for the jury. She told them about Irina's life, about her dreams and her sacrifices. She spoke of how Irina had worked multiple jobs to give her children a better life, how she had been so proud of Derek's academic achievements, how she had loved him unconditionally despite the challenges of raising a teenage boy as a single mother. Isabella described the last time she had spoken to her sister, just days before the murder, when Irina had called to share her joy about the new baby. "She was so happy," Isabella said, tears streaming down her face. She said she felt blessed to have two beautiful children. She said Derek had been so helpful with the baby, that he was going to be a good big brother. She trusted him. She loved him. And he repaid that love by killing her in the most brutal, horrific way imaginable. Isabella then turned her gaze directly to Derek, her eyes blazing with a mixture of pain and fury. "Look at me," she commanded, her voice rising. "Look at what you've taken from this world. Look at what you've done to our family." But Derek did not look at her. His eyes remained fixed on some point in the middle distance, his face as blank and emotionless as it had been throughout the entire trial. Isabella's voice broke as she continued. "You feel nothing, do you? Nothing at all. My sister gave you life. She fed you, clothed you, loved you, sacrificed everything for you. And you murdered her. You murdered her while she slept, while your baby sister lay just feet away. What kind of monster are you? What kind of thing masquerading as a human being could do what you did?" Her words hung in the air, a raw expression of grief and rage that seemed to fill the entire courtroom. Several jurors were visibly emotional, some wiping tears from their eyes. But Derek's expression never changed. He simply sat there, unmoved, as if Isabella were speaking a foreign language he couldn't understand. The next to speak was Irina's brother, a quiet, soft-spoken man named Roberto who worked as a mechanic in Miami. He spoke of the devastating impact of Irina's murder on the entire extended family, how it had fractured relationships and left everyone grappling with questions that had no answers. He spoke of the infant daughter, now being raised by relatives, who would grow up without ever knowing her mother, whose first memory of life would be the tragic story of how she lost her mother at just 2 weeks old. "That baby is innocent," Roberto said, his voice steady but filled with profound sadness. She did nothing to deserve this. She will grow up with a hole in her heart, a missing piece that can never be filled. And one day, when she's old enough to understand, we will have to tell her the truth. We will have to tell her that her mother was murdered by her own brother, that the person who should have protected her was the one who destroyed her family before she was even old enough to remember it. How do you explain that to a child? How do you make sense of such senseless evil? The courtroom fell silent after Roberto finished speaking, the weight of his words settling over everyone like a heavy shroud. Judge Hirsch announced that there would be a brief recess before closing arguments, giving everyone a moment to compose themselves after the emotional intensity of the victim impact statements. As the bailiffs led Derek out of the courtroom during the recess, observers noted that his demeanor had not changed even slightly. He had sat through the heartbreaking testimonies of his aunt and uncle with the same blank expression, showing no more emotion than he would watching paint dry. For the jury, this was perhaps the most damning evidence of all. They had just witnessed raw, genuine human grief, the kind of pain that comes from losing a loved one to violence. And they had watched Derek sit through it all completely unmoved, confirming everything the prosecution had been arguing about: his lack of empathy and his fundamentally broken emotional core. When the trial resumed, it was time for closing arguments, the final opportunity for both sides to make their case directly to the jury. Sarah Fernandez approached the lectern for the prosecution's closing with the confident air of someone who knew she had already won. Her argument was methodical and devastating, walking the jury through the evidence piece by piece, reminding them of everything they had seen and heard over the past weeks. She spoke of the premeditation evidenced by Derek's online searches, of the brutality of the attack evidenced by the 46 stab wounds, of his consciousness of guilt evidenced by the photographs and the 911 call, and of his complete lack of remorse evidenced by his behavior in court. She reminded them of the baby monitor footage, of the grandmother who could not bring herself to defend her own grandson, of the aunt and uncle whose grief was palpable and real. And then she addressed the defense's argument about adolescent brain development and mental illness. The defense wants you to believe that Derek Rosa is a sick child, that he needs treatment, not punishment. But let me ask you this. If he's so sick, if he was in such a dissociative state, how did he manage to research the best way to kill someone? How did he select the murder weapon? How did he wait until his mother was asleep and vulnerable? How did he take photographs and send messages? How did he call 911 and speak calmly and coherently to the dispatcher? These are not the actions of someone who has lost touch with reality. These are the actions of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and did it anyway. Fernandez then addressed Derek directly, her voice rising with conviction. That young man has sat in this courtroom for weeks, and he has shown you exactly who he is. Not once has he cried. Not once has he shown remorse. Not once has he acknowledged the pain he has caused. He has watched his own family members pour out their grief, and he has felt nothing. The defense wants you to see him as a child. But monsters come in all ages, and what you have seen in this courtroom is a monster. A monster who murdered his own mother while she slept, who photographed her body like a trophy, who has shown absolutely no recognition of the humanity of his victim or the horror of his crime. The evidence is overwhelming. The defendant's own behavior confirms everything we've told you. I ask you to return a verdict that reflects the truth of what happened on the night of October 12, 2023. Derek Rosa is guilty of first-degree murder, premeditated and deliberate. He planned it, he executed it, and he has shown no remorse. Hold him accountable. Give Irina Garcia and her family the justice they deserve. Jose Baez's closing argument was the performance of a man who knew he was fighting a losing battle but refused to surrender. He began by acknowledging the difficulty of his task, the overwhelming nature of the evidence, and the understandable anger and grief that the case had generated. But he urged the jury to look beyond the emotion, to remember their obligation to consider all of the evidence, including the evidence of Derek's age and mental state. He reminded them that Derek was just 13 years old when the crime occurred, that his brain was not fully developed, and that the law recognizes that children are fundamentally different from adults. He spoke of the psychological testimony about conduct disorder and dissociative states, arguing that these were not excuses but explanations, ways of understanding how such a horrific act could occur. Baez painted a picture of a child who was deeply mentally ill, who was failed by a system that should have identified his problems and intervened before tragedy struck. He argued that sending a 14-year-old to prison for life was not justice but vengeance, that it violated the fundamental principle that children are capable of redemption and rehabilitation. But even as Baez spoke, delivering his argument with passion and skill, it was clear that he was fighting an uphill battle. The jury's faces were impassive, their expressions suggesting that they had already made up their minds. Baez tried to address Derek's courtroom demeanor, arguing that his flat affect and lack of visible emotion were symptoms of his mental illness rather than evidence of his moral depravity. What you've interpreted as coldness and lack of remorse may actually be an inability to process and express emotion in the way that neurotypical individuals do, he argued. Derek Rosa is not well. He is profoundly ill, and punishing illness rather than treating it is not the purpose of our justice system. It was a valiant effort, but it was undermined by the simple fact that the jury had spent weeks watching Derek, and what they had seen did not match the narrative Baez was presenting. They had not seen a sick child. They had seen exactly what the prosecution described, a cold, calculating killer who happened to be young. As Baez concluded his argument and returned to his seat, there was a palpable sense in the courtroom that the outcome was no longer in doubt. The jury had heard all the evidence, they had observed the defendant, and they had made their judgment. Judge Hirsch provided the jury with their instructions, explaining the elements of first-degree murder, the definitions of premeditation and deliberation, and their obligation to consider all of the evidence before reaching a verdict. He reminded them that they were the sole judges of the facts, that they must set aside any sympathy or prejudice, and that their verdict must be based on the evidence presented in court. The jury was then escorted out of the courtroom to begin their deliberations, and the waiting began. The deliberations lasted just under 6 hours, a relatively short time given the complexity of the case and the severity of the charges. Legal experts observing the trial noted that quick deliberations in cases with overwhelming evidence typically signal a guilty verdict. When word came that the jury had reached a verdict, the courtroom filled quickly, spectators, media, family members, and court officials all taking their places for the moment of truth. Derek was brought back into the courtroom by the bailiffs, his expression as blank as ever. He took his seat at the defense table between his attorneys, showing no visible signs of nervousness or concern. The jury filed in, their faces solemn, none of them making eye contact with the defendant, a sign that experienced trial watchers recognize as an indicator of a guilty verdict. Judge Hirsch asked the foreperson if the jury had reached a verdict. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman who had been elected by her fellow jurors, stood and confirmed that they had. The verdict form was handed to the judge, who reviewed it briefly before handing it to the clerk to be read aloud. The courtroom fell into an absolute silence, the kind of silence that seems to have weight and substance. The clerk stood and read in a clear, steady voice. In the case of the state of Florida versus Derek Rosa, on the charge of murder in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant, Derek Rosa, guilty as charged. A wave of emotions swept through the gallery. Irina's family members embraced each other, some sobbing with relief, others sitting in stunned silence. The Justice for Derek supporters gasped and cried out, several of them leaving the courtroom in tears. At the defense table, Jose Baez closed his eyes briefly, his face reflecting the exhaustion and disappointment of a lawyer who had given everything to a case and still lost. Derek Rosa's reaction, or rather his lack of reaction, was the final confirmation of everything the jury had concluded about him. He simply sat there, his face expressionless, showing no visible response to the verdict that had just sealed his fate. It was as if the words had not even registered, as if he were watching something happening to someone else entirely. Judge Hirsch thanked the jury for their service and informed them that they would return in 3 weeks for the sentencing phase of the trial. In Florida, even though Derek was being tried as an adult, his age at the time of the crime meant that he could not receive the death penalty or even a mandatory life sentence without parole. The jury would have to make a recommendation on sentencing, and the judge would have the final say, but the range of possibilities was limited by Derek's status as a juvenile offender. The maximum sentence would be life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years, a significant punishment but one that at least held out the theoretical possibility of eventual release. The minimum would be a lengthy prison term in the juvenile system with eventual transfer to adult prison. The sentencing phase would be another battle, another opportunity for both sides to argue about what should happen to Derek Rosa. In the 3 weeks between the verdict and the sentencing hearing, Derek remained in custody at the Metro West Detention Center. Reports from the facility indicated that his behavior remained unchanged. He was quiet, compliant with rules, and kept to himself. He showed no signs of the emotional breakdown that often occurs when defendants are finally forced to confront the reality of their situation. He ate his meals, participated in the limited educational programming available to juvenile inmates in adult facilities, and spent his time reading and sleeping. To the guards and counselors who interacted with him, he remained an enigma, a polite, soft-spoken teenager who seemed utterly disconnected from the magnitude of what he had done and what awaited him. The sentencing hearing, when it finally arrived, brought the case to its dramatic conclusion. The courtroom was once again packed, with even more media presence than during the trial itself. Everyone wanted to witness the moment when Derek Rosa would finally learn his fate. The prosecution presented additional victim impact statements, including letters from community members and mental health professionals who argued that Derek posed a continued danger to society and should receive the maximum possible sentence. The defense presented testimony from experts in juvenile rehabilitation who argued that even someone as damaged as Derek could potentially be helped with intensive therapy and treatment, that his young age meant he was not beyond redemption. They presented studies on brain plasticity in adolescence, arguing that Derek's brain was still developing and that with proper intervention, he could potentially develop the empathy and moral reasoning that he currently lacked. It was a desperate argument, built on hope and possibility rather than any concrete evidence that Derek was capable of change or wanted to change. The most anticipated moment of the sentencing hearing, however, came not from expert witnesses or victim statements, but from an unexpected source. As Judge Hirsch was preparing to hear final arguments on sentencing recommendations, a commotion arose in the gallery. Derek's grandmother, the same woman who had refused to testify on his behalf during the trial, stood up from her seat. Her face was pale but determined, her hands gripping the back of the bench in front of her. "Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking but clear, "I need to speak. There is something the court needs to know, something I have been too afraid to say." Judge Hirsch, surprised by the interruption, looked at the prosecution and defense tables. Sarah Fernandez nodded, indicating she had no objection. Jose Baez, looking both confused and concerned, also indicated his consent. The judge, recognizing the gravity of the moment, allowed the grandmother to approach the witness stand. What followed was a testimony that would become the defining moment of the entire case, a revelation so powerful and unexpected that it would shift the entire narrative. Derek's grandmother took the oath and sat down, her hands trembling in her lap. Through the interpreter, she began to speak, and what she revealed was a dark family secret that had been buried for years. She testified that Derek had not been the quiet, normal child that everyone described. From a very young age, he had exhibited disturbing behaviors that the family had tried to hide, to explain away, to pretend didn't exist. She spoke of incidents when Derek was just 6 or 7 years old, when he had been caught torturing insects, pulling the wings off flies, and watching them suffer with what she described as a look of fascination, not the normal curiosity of a child, but something darker, something cold. She described how, when he was 8, a neighbor's cat had disappeared, and she had later found Derek in the apartment with scratches on his arms, insisting he didn't know what happened to the animal. The cat was never found. The grandmother's voice grew stronger as she continued, years of guilt and suppressed knowledge pouring out in a torrent. She testified that when Derek was 10, there had been an incident at school where another student had been pushed down a flight of stairs. Derek had been suspected but never charged, the other child too frightened to identify his attacker. Irina had been called to the school multiple times over the years for Derek's behavior, incidents of bullying, of threatening other students, of concerning essays and drawings that depicted violence. But Irina, desperate to protect her son, had always made excuses, had moved him to different schools, had hidden the truth from authorities and family members alike. "My daughter loved him so much," the grandmother said, tears streaming down her face, that she could not see what he was becoming. Or maybe she saw it, but refused to believe it. She kept thinking he would grow out of it, that if she just loved him enough, he would be okay. But he never grew out of it. He just got better at hiding it. The grandmother then revealed the most devastating piece of information. In the months before the murder, Irina had called her mother in Cuba, terrified and crying. She had told her mother that she was afraid of Derek, that she had found disturbing things on his computer, searches about violence and death, that she had caught him standing over the baby's crib in the middle of the night, just staring at the infant with that blank look in his eyes. Irina had been planning to send Derek to Cuba to live with relatives, to get him away from the baby, to get him help. She had been researching mental health facilities and had even started the paperwork for the trip. But before any of this could happen, Derek had killed her. He knew, the grandmother said, her voice breaking. He knew my daughter was going to send him away, that she was finally going to get him the help he needed. And he killed her before she could. This was not a sudden break. This was not illness. This was a choice made by someone who knew exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. The impact of this testimony was seismic. It completely reframed the entire case. What had been presented as a troubled child's inexplicable act of violence was now revealed to be something far more calculated and sinister. Derek had not killed his mother in a moment of psychological crisis. He had killed her to prevent her from taking action that would have disrupted his life and potentially exposed the darkness he had been carefully hiding for years. The prosecution immediately requested a recess to investigate these new revelations, while the defense objected strenuously, arguing that this testimony was hearsay and should not be considered during sentencing. Judge Hirsch, however, allowed the testimony to stand, noting that sentencing hearings have different evidentiary standards than trials, and that the grandmother's statements went directly to the question of the defendant's character and potential for rehabilitation. During the recess, investigators moved quickly to verify the grandmother's claims. They obtained records from Derek's previous schools, finding documentation of multiple behavioral incidents that had been minimized or covered up. They interviewed former teachers and school counselors who confirmed that there had been concerns about Derek going back years. They obtained search warrants for Irina's computer and phone records, finding her Google searches for mental health facilities and messages to family members in Cuba discussing her fears about Derek's behavior. Everything the grandmother had said was corroborated by documentary evidence. When the hearing resumed, the prosecution presented this new evidence, painting a picture not of a child who had suddenly snapped, but of a predator who had been carefully managed and protected by a mother who loved him too much to see the danger he posed, until it was finally too late. Jose Baez, blindsided by these revelations, attempted damage control. He argued that this new information actually supported the defense's position that Derek was severely mentally ill and in need of treatment. But the argument rang hollow. The pattern of behavior the grandmother had described was not that of a child with a treatable mental illness. It was the pattern of someone with a fundamental absence of empathy, someone who had learned from a young age to hide his true nature, and who had become increasingly sophisticated in his deception as he grew older. The jury, recalled to hear the new evidence and provide an updated sentencing recommendation, looked at Derek with new understanding. They had already found him guilty, but now they understood the full scope of who he was and what he represented. Throughout this devastating testimony, Derek Rosa maintained his characteristic blank expression, but observers noted something new. When his grandmother spoke about his mother's fears, about her plans to send him away, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Not remorse, not sadness, but anger. A brief, quickly suppressed flash of rage that suggested the grandmother had struck a nerve, had revealed the truth that Derek had spent his entire life trying to hide. For the first time in the entire proceedings, the mask slipped, and the jury saw what his grandmother had been describing. The cold, calculating mind that existed behind the facade of the quiet honor roll student. It was a glimpse of the real Derek Rosa, and it was terrifying. When the grandmother finished her testimony and returned to her seat in the gallery, the courtroom was engulfed in a heavy, profound silence. Judge Hirsch called for final arguments on sentencing. Sarah Fernandez approached the lectern with a grim determination. Her recommendation was simple and unequivocal: life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years, the maximum sentence available under Florida law for a juvenile offender convicted of first-degree murder. She argued that Derek had demonstrated through years of hidden behavior that he was not a child who made a mistake, but a dangerous individual who would always pose a threat to others. She pointed to his complete lack of remorse, to his mother's own fears about him, and to the pattern of violence and deception that stretched back to his early childhood. "This defendant has shown us exactly who he is," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "Not just in the murder itself, but in every interaction, every moment he has spent in this courtroom. He feels nothing. He regrets nothing. And if given the opportunity, there is every reason to believe he would do it again." Jose Baez made his final plea for leniency, arguing that even with these new revelations, Derek was still just a child, that his age at the time of the crime had to be the primary consideration in sentencing. He spoke of the fundamental principle that children are different from adults, that they are more capable of change and rehabilitation, and that the purpose of the juvenile justice system is to reform rather than simply punish. But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The jury, in their sentencing recommendation, voted unanimously for the maximum possible sentence. They recommended that Derek Rosa be sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility only after serving 40 years, a sentence that would keep him incarcerated until he was in his 50s. Judge Richard Hirsch, a man who had presided over countless criminal cases in his decades on the bench, took the unusual step of delivering an extended statement before imposing sentence. He spoke directly to Derek, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and stern judgment. "Mr. Rosa," he began, "I have spent a considerable amount of time observing you during this trial and during these sentencing proceedings. I have watched you sit in this courtroom, day after day, showing no emotion, no remorse, no recognition of the magnitude of what you have done. I have heard the evidence of your crime, evidence so disturbing and so brutal that it has been difficult for seasoned law enforcement officers and jurors to comprehend. I have heard testimony about your behavior going back years, a pattern of cruelty and deception that suggests this crime was not an aberration but a culmination." The judge paused, his eyes fixed on Derek, who sat motionless at the defense table. "Your attorney has asked this court to show you mercy, to consider your age, to give you a chance at redemption. But mercy is earned through remorse, through acknowledgement of wrongdoing, through a sincere desire to change. You have shown none of these things. You murdered your own mother, a woman who loved you unconditionally, who worked multiple jobs to provide for you, who was so concerned about your welfare that she was planning to get you help. You stabbed her 46 times while she slept, while your infant sister lay just feet away. You then photographed her body, sent pictures to your friends, and called 911 with the same emotional engagement you might have while ordering a pizza. And since that night, you have shown not one single moment of genuine remorse or human empathy." Judge Hirsch's voice grew harder, more forceful. "Your grandmother, your own grandmother, had to come to this court and expose painful family secrets because she understood that the truth had to be told, that justice required the full picture of who you are and what you represent. She testified that your mother was afraid of you, that she had seen the darkness in you and was trying to protect your baby sister from you. And you killed her for it. You killed her because she was going to disrupt your life, because she was finally going to force you to face consequences for your actions. That was not illness, Mr. Rosa. That was not a child making a mistake. That was calculated, premeditated murder designed to eliminate a threat to your continued existence as you preferred to live it." The judge then delivered the sentence, his words falling like hammer blows. "It is the judgment of this court that you, Derek Rosa, be sentenced to life in prison with the eligibility for parole only after you have served 40 years of that sentence. This means that you will be 54 years old before you can even be considered for release. This court makes this decision based not just on the horrific nature of your crime, but on your complete and utter lack of remorse, on the pattern of behavior that led to this crime, and on the need to protect society from the danger you represent. You have shown this court that you are incapable of empathy, incapable of remorse, and fundamentally broken in a way that makes you a danger to everyone around you." It was at this precise moment, as the finality of the words 40 years echoed through the courtroom, that Derek Rosa's carefully maintained facade finally, catastrophically shattered. The blank expression that had been his constant mask throughout months of hearings and weeks of trial dissolved in an instant, replaced by a look of pure, undiluted panic. His face went white, his eyes went wide, and for the first time since his arrest, genuine emotion flooded his features. It was not remorse for his mother. It was not guilt for his crime. It was raw, selfish terror at the realization of what he had lost. The illusion of control, the belief that his youth would save him, the confidence that he could game the system, all of it evaporated in that moment, leaving behind only the stark, horrifying reality that he would spend most of his life in a cage. As the bailiffs approached to take him back into custody, Derek's composure crumbled completely. A strangled, choked sound escaped his throat, something between a sob and a gasp. His hands, which had been folded calmly on the table throughout the entire trial, began to tremble. He looked around the courtroom with wild, desperate eyes, as if searching for an escape that did not exist. His carefully controlled breathing became ragged and uneven. The transformation was shocking in its completeness. In the space of a few seconds, the calm, detached teenager had become a frightened child, finally confronting the consequences of his actions. But even in this moment of breakdown, observers noted that his distress was entirely self-focused. He did not cry out for his mother, did not express regret for what he had done to her or to his baby sister. His panic was purely about himself, about his own lost future, about the decades of confinement that stretched out before him. As the bailiffs placed their hands on his arms to lead him from the courtroom, Derek resisted for the first time, pulling back slightly, his body going rigid. "No," he said, his voice cracking, barely above a whisper. "No, please." But there was no mercy, no reprieve. The bailiffs, professional and unmoved, guided him firmly toward the door that would lead him back to his cell and then to a state prison where he would spend the next 4 decades. As he was led away, he turned his head back toward the courtroom, toward his grandmother who sat weeping in the gallery, toward the family of his mother who watched with grim satisfaction, toward the life he had destroyed and the future he had forfeited. The heavy doors closed behind him with a resounding finality, the metallic sound echoing through the silent courtroom like a period at the end of a terrible sentence. In the gallery, Irina Garcia's family embraced each other, their tears a mixture of relief, sorrow, and a grief that would never fully heal. They had waited over a year for this moment, for justice to be served. And while no sentence could bring Irina back or undo the trauma inflicted on her infant daughter, there was some small comfort in knowing that her killer would be held accountable. Isabella, Irina's sister, spoke to reporters outside the courthouse, her voice steady despite her tears. "My sister loved that boy more than anything in the world," she said. "She gave him everything she had, and he took her from us in the most horrible way possible. Today, justice was done. It won't bring her back, but at least he will never have the chance to hurt anyone else." The case of Derek Rosa would continue to reverberate through the community long after the courtroom doors closed. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of enabling troubled children, about the importance of recognizing warning signs of violence, and about the capacity for evil that can exist even in the young. Mental health professionals used the case in training, examining the red flags that had been missed or ignored over years of Derek's development. School districts revised their protocols for reporting concerning behavior. Legislators debated bills to improve access to mental health services for troubled youth. But beneath all the policy discussions and professional analyses was a simple, terrible truth that haunted everyone who had followed the case. Sometimes, monsters do come in small packages. Sometimes, evil wears the face of a child. And sometimes, no amount of love or intervention can change what someone fundamentally is. Derek Rosa is currently incarcerated in a Florida state prison, housed in a unit designated for juvenile offenders serving adult sentences. According to reports from corrections officials, he remains a model prisoner, quiet, compliant, and showing no signs of behavioral problems. He participates in educational programs and has earned his high school diploma through correspondence courses. To the guards and counselors who interact with him, he appears to be a polite, intelligent young man serving his time. But those who knew the case, those who sat through the trial and saw behind the mask, understand that his good behavior is likely just another form of the deception he practiced his entire life. He will be eligible for parole consideration in the year 2063 when he is 54 years old. Whether he will ever be released, whether he will ever develop the capacity for genuine remorse and empathy, remains an open question that only time will answer. The infant daughter, now a toddler, is being raised by Irina's sister Isabella in Cuba, far from the apartment where her mother was murdered and the brother who committed that murder. She is too young to remember that terrible night, too young to understand the tragedy that shaped her life before it had barely begun. As she grows, her family will have to decide when and how to tell her the truth about what happened to her mother, about the brother who took their mother away. It is a burden no child should have to bear, but one that she will carry for the rest of her life. In photographs shared by the family, she is a beautiful, smiling child, surrounded by love and protection. She is Irina Garcia's living legacy, a reminder of the life that was stolen and the future that was shattered by one horrific act of violence. The courtroom where Derek Rosa was tried and sentenced has since hosted hundreds of other cases, the normal churn of the criminal justice system continuing its relentless work. But those who were present for that trial, the jurors, the lawyers, the court staff, and the journalists, all carry with them the memory of those weeks, the memory of watching a teenage boy sit impassively through evidence of his own monstrous act, of seeing a mother's love used as both weapon and shield, of witnessing the final shattering of a carefully maintained illusion. It is a case that challenged fundamental assumptions about childhood innocence, about the capacity for evil, and about the limits of mercy and redemption. As the sun set on the final day of Derek Rosa's sentencing, casting long shadows across the Miami-Dade County Courthouse, the story reached its conclusion. A 14-year-old boy who had entered the courtroom with a smirk and a belief that his age would protect him had learned the hardest lesson possible. The justice system, for all its flaws and complexities, can see through deception. A jury of his peers, regular citizens called to perform one of democracy's most difficult duties, had looked past his youth and his lawyer's arguments and had seen him for exactly what he was. And in the end, the mask that had protected him, the facade of the quiet honor roll student, had been ripped away not by prosecutors or detectives, but by his own family members who finally found the courage to tell the truth. The case serves as a stark reminder that evil does not always announce itself with obvious signs. It can hide behind good grades and polite manners. It can be protected by a mother's desperate love and a family's willful blindness. It can exist in the heart of a child who looks like any other teenager, but who carries within them a void where empathy and conscience should be. Derek Rosa thought he was untouchable, that his youth and his carefully constructed image would shield him from consequences. But in the end, the very people who should have been his greatest defenders, his own grandmother and extended family, became the instruments of his downfall, their painful honesty exposing the truth that he had spent a lifetime trying to hide. The murder of Irina Garcia was not just a family tragedy. It was a community trauma, a cultural moment that forced difficult conversations about mental health, juvenile justice, and the nature of evil itself. It left scars on everyone it touched, from the first responders who discovered the scene to the jurors who had to view the evidence, from the lawyers who fought the case to the family members who lost someone they loved. And at the center of it all was a teenage boy who committed an act of unfathomable violence, and then spent months showing the world exactly who he was, a monster in child's clothing, incapable of remorse and dangerous beyond measure. As Derek Rosa spends his first night in prison knowing that he will not see freedom until he is in his 50s, if ever, one can only wonder if he finally understands what he has lost. Does he comprehend the magnitude of his crime? Does he feel any genuine remorse for the mother he murdered? Or is his current distress, like everything else about him, purely self-centered, concerned only with his own suffering and his own lost future? The answer to these questions may never be known. What is certain is that justice, in its imperfect but essential way, has been served. A killer has been held accountable. A family has received some measure of closure. And a community can finally begin the long, difficult process of healing from a wound that will never fully close. The story of Derek Rosa and the murder of Irina Garcia is a tragedy in the truest sense of the word. It is a story about the limits of maternal love, about the dangers of denial, about the capacity for evil in the young, and about the terrible, final price that is paid when all the warning signs are ignored until it is too late. It is a story that will be told in law schools and psychology classes, in true crime documentaries and cautionary lectures, for years to come. But at its heart, it is simply a story of a mother who loved her son, a son who betrayed that love in the most brutal way imaginable, and a justice system that, despite all its imperfections, managed to see through the lies and deliver a verdict that reflected the truth. In the end, Derek Rosa entered that courtroom thinking he was untouchable, protected by his age and his facade. He learned, in the most devastating way possible, that he was wrong. The smirk is gone now, replaced by the reality of decades behind bars, a living consequence of the terrible choice he made on that October night when he took his mother's life and destroyed his own.